Hey, welcome to the ReThink Podcast, where we talk Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and
turtles.
Survival in times of
Let's go. That's
shortage.
like my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Theology,
And,
Bitcoin, and surviving.
We're also talking about harlots and
Yeah, that's not my deal.
what is your text? It's your text for the weekend. Rahab, the
No, I'm not preaching
mine.
that. That's for ours.
Yeah.
I'm preaching about. I preached about Moses, and now I'm going to preach about the others.
others. I'm doing the others too. Who's doing
skip
the
the
harlot in Clay County?
Van Heine.
Ben Van Heining. Good luck, Ben. All right. Well, here we are, and we're working our way through Hebrews 11, and there's just 3 of us. Divine number now.
Yeah.
Well,
That's why we gave you the head of the table.
We had
right.
Ben Farley, we had the number of all the earth, but now we have a number of divinity. That's a scary thing to say. You shouldn't have said that.
And then there were 3.
It's actually kind of like the Hunger Games. You know, since we were talking about survival, we're the 3 remaining after Greece.
Greece was hard on us.
Ben jumped off a bridge.
I tell you what was hard on
Well, now
us
there's
is
3 of us. So
Bunker making us earn our breakfast.
yeah,
My arms are still sore.
I was telling that story to my life group last night, and they were like, "Did anyone volunteer to stay in your room twice?" I was like, "Farrar." He's like, "I'm in." So
He's a
Yep.
maniac.
I was like, 1, 2, 9, 11. I mean, I got to 100, but I don't,
Yeah. That's
know.
how my son was counting this morning for
Perfect.
his push-ups.
Perfect.
How many does he have to do?
This morning was 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups.
That's his punishment for just waking up.
You woke up before Dad went to work.
You know,
Get on the ground.
I said,
Must not be tired enough, son.
I said, you ought to be thanking me because I'm letting you do this while it's like 85 degrees out instead of like 110 this afternoon.
Here's a question I have. AC on at your house?
It is.
It is.
It
Oh,
is.
man.
So I even broke down. So our upstairs gets a little hot sometimes, and I went ahead and
Sweatbox.
put in the ACs upstairs too, just
Oh.
to.
Gosh, you're
You know.
getting soft in your age.
Yeah.
Well,
Man.
we are. So let's talk about this text. You're going to have to lead us through the
Sure.
points of it, but I'll read it. You want me to read it?
Sure, go ahead.
Let's read it. Because at least there'll be some good content. If nothing else goes positive, the whole podcast. Here we go. You are picking up in verse 29.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Mhm.
By faith. It seems a little redundant. He says that with all these people.
I think he wants to make a point.
By faith. The people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. So we're back to Moses there. I went too far back, didn't I? You're not in verse 29. Do you even know where you're preaching?
Yeah, I started in verse 29 now.
Oh.
And I jumped to verse 30, Jericho.
The Egyptians all drowned. Verse 30. 40 years later. Well, he skips 40 years. But not a lot of faithfulness in that. Yeah, just survival. 40 years later, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who are disobedient. So give us some backstory in case folks don't know. We'll assume our 2 listeners don't know the story. And
They probably know it better than us.
they probably do. I'm
Just
sure
being-
Terry Sapp does.
Yeah, so
Go for it.
basically what we have to do is what we've been doing this entire series. We've read Hebrews 11, and then we've left Hebrews 11, and we've gone to the Old Testament. And so you alluded to it a little bit. So we leave Hebrews 11, we go to Joshua chapter 2, and we see that there is a new generation of people that are getting ready to enter into the Promised Land. Only 2 remain, Caleb and Joshua.
That's the backstory there. We got time in the podcast to make sure we know that.
So you're talking, is it 38 roughly years of wilderness wandering? Like 38 years since...
40 total, yeah.
Yeah. So if you go back to Numbers, you see that Moses sends 12 into the land to check it out.
You gonna sing
Well,
the
men
song?
went to spy on.
I can't sing the song. I thought about it. Do you know the song? I don't remember it.
Oh, please.
I really don't.
You grew up in church, man.
I did, but we didn't have flannel grass.
12 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were good and 2 were bad.
Yep.
What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 were good and 2 were bad.
I knew the song. I just
Some
wanted to
saw
see if you do it.
giants, big and tall. Some saw grapes and clusters fall.
Oh,
That's nice.
Giving the people what
Yeah.
they want.
Some saw God ruled over all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. That still is my favorite part. 10 were bad and 2 were good.
You can do that
That,
fast.
that's slick.
I was a youth minister for a while.
Yeah.
Kids church.
Kids church.
10 were bad and 2 were good.
So yeah, you just gave us the context.
People are gonna remember that forever now.
Mhm.
That's how I remember it. 10
You
were
want to
bad
sing
and
with
2
me?
were good.
I can do it again if you want to sing with me.
No, I'm good.
JP, he's still in the student audience. You want to sing with me?
Never heard that.
Last time.
Never heard that song?
Well, I guess a new song's gonna be sung this Sunday.
not here, Mom.
Da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so that's the story.
Yeah. So 10 come
Joshua and
back.
Caleb are the two
Yeah.
good.
They're the two good. They're the only ones that remain, which I think is kind of interesting.
Pretty awesome. They're old when we come back around the second time too.
I was trying to figure out the exact age. Do you know?
80,
80s. Okay.
which is Moses too.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
From Mount Pisgah's lofty heights, he does not get to enter in.
Yep. So.
I was sharing that
I
story
viewed my
last
home
night,
and
too.
took my flight. That's another hymn.
Yeah, it is.
I like that one. I don't know that one as well.
I don't know that one. I didn't even know it was a hymn.
From Mount Pisgah's lofty heights, I viewed my home and took my flight. Moses' song.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
Moses sends 12. 2 were good.
Good.
Yeah.
10 were
10 were bad.
bad.
Why were they bad? You know?
They give me the answer here.
I was asking
Faith,
you.
it's a faith issue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they go in there and they go, "Oh, we could never take this
Yeah.
land. Like they would
Right.
stomp all over us."
In
Physically.
our eyes, we're
Right.
grasshoppers to them,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And looking at the city, like for instance, if Jericho, the fortified city that they come to first, it would have been physically not likely that they would overtake that city, not militarily. It was that's the western or the eastern, outpost of the kingdom of the Canaanites and the Amorites, who were a vicious people. You could race around that wall in chariots and meet each other on top of the wall. It was fortified beyond, and there's a spring there. If you go back to, I'm stealing your story. Can I do that?
Go ahead.
Second.
You're talking 2 walls, even.
That's a complicated issue in our minds. What it was they built a wall,
Yep.
and they fill that in, and then they build a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't just knock that wall down. It's a rampart, basically. It's impossible to just make that just shake and fall down.
Yeah.
And so it's wide enough that they could race up on the top of it. But if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 2, you have the story, Elijah and Elisha, prophets together. Elijah is going to be taken up in a whirlwind to heaven. The chariots of fire come down. They're at the Jordan River at Jericho, which is probably Bethany beyond the Jordan, where Jesus is baptized, where they cross now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where Elijah is taken up into heaven. Elijah rolls up his cloak, parts the waters there. It's kind of a prophetic. This is the way things are there. It's just anyway. They come back and the water of the city was bitter. The spring was bitter, and he purifies it. It's his first miracle there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why this city is. All this is backstory as to why, by faith, they said we can't do it, and they were right.
Mm-hmm.
But God can. That's the problem, is that they're looking at their strength versus the fortifications and the inhabitants, and they say we can't do it, and they're right. But they've lost the sight of who's delivering them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
They
the whole
lost
point of the
their faith.
plagues and the whole scenario of the Ten Commandments. I mean, you got people who have experienced all that, and then they still don't trust that going forward.
Mm-hmm. And so what's God do? He waits till they all perish, except for 2. And I think Joshua.
There's a picture there, right? You can't receive the things that God promises to you without faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't get to enter the promised land. We don't get to enter the promised land without faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Better add that in.
I think it's funny that Joshua was like, okay, Moses sent 12, and 12 was too many, so I'm going to send 2. Like I think that had to be in the back of his mind. And so he sends 2 men. His first instruction is to go into this land and search out Jericho, right? And the text says that they come to Rahab's house, the harlot prostitute, and they stay there. They enter into her home. Now, if you're a skeptic and you're reading this, I think one of the first questions is like, why would they go there? Like these are men of God that are in a city trying to spy and figure out how they can take the city, and they show up to the home of a prostitute. Why?
Because that's where the lot lizards were.
Yep. If you wanted to enter into a city and not be and hide, that's where you show up.
So where do all the not all, too many of the traveling men go when they come to town?
Yep.
Bingo. Yep. Yeah. So the city is very accustomed to travelers visiting with Rahab.
Mm-hmm. And so they go to Rahab's house. She hides them. The king finds out that there's men of Israel there. So the king sends men to go and find them. She lies and says that they've left the city, when in fact she's hid them on her roof under the stalks of grain. That's another thing. If you're a skeptic, you're like, why is it okay to lie? And I think you pointed that out last week pretty well. So I'll kind of let you.
Yeah, just a little bit. So there's God's law, God's law and man's law. And God has instituted governments to, rule over the people and stuff like that. But there are times when we are faced with a choice either to obey God's rules or man's rules. And when those conflict, God's law always supersedes man's laws.
Mm-hmm.
So last week I alluded to the killing of babies because the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt ordered that all baby boys be killed. Well, obviously that goes against God's who he is and his law, and so Moses' parents don't follow the edict. They knew that there might be consequences for doing that, but they considered God's law and obeying that worth the cost, even if they get the punishment of it. And that's what we have to realize is it may cost us when we disobey man's rules, but God's law always supersedes those.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little different than the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah.
Which is civil disobedience for self.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's maybe the wrong thing to do. I'm not saying that. But this is, you're defying law because of a higher calling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God's law.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like you're living in that tension because we are to follow the law of the land, but when the law of the land contradicts God's law, disobedience is expected.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I think you got to be careful with that because there are some things that are in our culture that aren't against God's law that we would push against. You know what I mean? And so you got to be really careful. And anyway, she hides them. She lies. The men go out and search. And I think that it's interesting how she goes up to the roof and she has a conversation with them before she goes to sleep. And she says that she's heard about God. She's heard what he's done in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. She says that I think in verse 9. And then in verse 10,
This is Joshua 2.
Yeah, this is Joshua 2. And in verse 10, she has another declaration, a reminder of who God is and what he's done. And then in verse 11, she says, I believe that your God is the God of heaven and the God of earth. It's a declaration of who he is, what he's done, and what's her first response? Belief. I mean, it's
radical
crazy.
Considering the life that she's a part of. There's a Canaanite, specifically she's Amorite. So these are nasty, God-hating people, right? I read somewhere that they laid the foundations of their buildings, and to dedicate them to the gods, they would take a jar and place a living infant, in the jar, and encapsulate them in the wall as a dedication piece to the gods to preserve the building.
Wow.
That's the kind of people you're dealing with.
Well, and so I'm sitting there thinking, okay.
That's why God says destroy them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20. And I think, I'll get there, but I think it's crazy to me that her entire life, she has been vulnerable to men like that, her whole life. And then 2 men of God show up, and her response is faith. You know how easy it would have been for her to choose fear?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's what the entire city does. When they come in direct contact with God's will, their first reaction is to protect. Her first reaction is to surrender. Like it is the gospel in the Old Testament story.
Yeah. I think another thing too is whenever we think through the story, you just pointed out, the response is faith and surrender.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we come in our evangelism of like changing someone to faith, if it makes sense, like let's change the behavior so that you can get to faith. And Rahab's is, I believe, and causes her to start walking.
James 2:25. James says, "Was not Rahab credited because of her faith as righteous?"
Yeah,
because of what she did.
Right.
When she housed the spies.
Yeah.
Yeah. She because of faith she acts.
Right.
Yeah.
We get that backwards in our mind sometimes. Like we got to get ourselves all figured out and cleaned up to come to faith. And Rahab's response is like in the midst of her mess, she comes to faith.
Well, she is at the lowest of lows in her life. She's the dirtiest of dirtiest. She is the last person you think that God could use, and he shows up and uses her in an incredible way. And her step, what I love is, it's so simple. It's not a leap, right? Like it's not a huge step. It's a simple step of obedience. Because I was thinking about like what is in the greater picture of things, what does she actually have? The only thing that she brings to the table here in this situation at first is sin. Because like when we think of a hero of faith, our first thought is, what does a hero overcome? Like we want to talk about what they've done, but she hasn't done anything.
Except she sets herself on the side of God.
Yeah.
Because this choice, when it's found out, if the walls aren't destroyed, if the people aren't killed, she's punished. She's dead.
She's dead.
Right? And so she chooses at that moment to align herself with God.
Yep. As
opposed to the fear response, which would have been to protect herself in the natural way. Like to lie.
Yeah.
Or to turn them in.
Yeah.
Right? But she doesn't do that. She chooses, because of faith, to align herself with God.
Yeah.
It also points out how little you actually need to know to
Yep.
No kidding.
to follow God.
All she had heard is what God had done in the wilderness. And that was enough. Like, Romans 10 talks about that faith comes from hearing. She had not seen anything with her own eyes. She had heard. And that's all she needed to put her faith in the Lord. Like that's powerful. I mean, she has faith, but then in the middle of the chapter, I think it's verse 15 or so, she begins to ask for something. She asks to be saved, which I think is pretty cool.
So she's always known now as Rahab the harlot, right? Now the prostitute, we call her. But she's David's great grandma.
Yeah.
Insertion into the line, Matthew chapter 1, the line of the Messiah. That's what God does.
Yeah.
I love that part of the story. He didn't just pick anybody. He picked somebody who's always going to be known in this world,
Right,
by men as Rahab the harlot. And he said, no, she's in the line of the Messiah. I'm going to save the world through what she has done by faith.
Yep.
Yeah.
New identity, new purpose.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you flip to the New Testament and in the genealogy, there's a woman mentioned. That's
an Amorite woman.
Yeah, I was gonna say not even a Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, and oh man, I think it's chapter 6, verse 23 says that when when they go in, right, they go into the city, and they Deuteronomy 20 and Deuteronomy 7 says that they are to not leave anything breathing. They are to kill everything. When they go into the city and they follow God's plan and they save Rahab and her family, it says that they take her and they put her outside of the tents of Israel. Like, so she's away from camp. But then verse 25 says that she is in Israel now forever, I think is what it says. I don't have my Bible with me in front of me. But it's exactly what you said. She's unclean. She's not a Jew. She's not a part of the family. And then you flip to Matthew chapter 1, and she's in the family. Mm-hmm. And not only is she in the family,
the only one that's saved.
She's it. I think it's cool too because we're kind of all over the place in the story, but there, she asks to be saved. They agree, and they say, "Hey, if you stay here, right, you'll our oath, this is the promise. Hang the scarlet cord in the window, right?"
Man,
and
doesn't that just sound like Passover lamb's blood to you?
Yes, it's amazing, and scarlet cord, and that's the promise she holds on to for an entire week as God's people just march around that city. Can you imagine?
I wonder what she's thinking. She's like, "Wait, I signed up for this."
Yeah,
they're going on a marching
I'm going
band tour.
with them, and this is it.
Can you imagine?
A bunch of pansies who won't even fight.
Yeah, it's just the parallels of the gospel are crazy, because it says that she lives in the wall. Her home is in the wall, and so she hangs the cord in her window. And I was sitting there thinking, like, the very thing that is supposed to keep God out of that city, he has her hang that scarlet cord.
Does it say window?
It says in the window.
Does it?
Yeah.
So what would happen? I've been to Jericho a couple of times. Went with an archaeologist, which was fascinating. Trying to set my cup down so it didn't go like that. There's the earthen mound again would be the lower level walls, and then they build their walls on top of that. That's their brick walls. So to scale that and then it just physically, wasn't going to happen. So she's living inside the brick walls on top of this ramparts element, which was a lot of people lived in those walls, right? Dual usage of the construction process, I guess. So the chariot racing would go on top of their roof. What's awesome about it is the way that these bricks have fallen. And if you get the pamphlet, of course it's run by the Palestinian Authority now, because Jericho is in a Palestinian-controlled area. And so you get the pamphlet. They deny everything about this story being taken by the Hebrews, right? Because they don't want any Jewish right to that location today. They don't want that to happen. And so the pamphlet says that none of this is real. But you can go out there. I literally did this myself. Scratch back the dirt and see the remnants of the bricks. You can actually see the bricks that have fallen from the wall in the dirt from the excavations. And then you mentioned a detail that I thought reminded me of something pretty cool. Catherine Kenyon in the 50s, I believe it was, did an excavation cut. And so she basically cut a key path into the middle of that tell or mound. There's 26 layers of civilization there. Wow. She cut a layer, and the layer that is this period of the conquest is burnt. You can see it. It's about that thick, and it's charcoal black. And in the midst of that, there are jars. You can still see some of them, not many. You can see a lot of fragments. The jars, and when they uncovered that, those jars were filled with grain. Right? It was a storage room that she cut through. And so you go back and you read the text in Joshua. When they crossed the Jordan River, it's at flood stage, and they had just finished the harvest.
Yep.
And what did she hide the men under on her roof?
Grain.
Grain,
Yep.
Stalks of grain. So she had gathered, or somebody had gathered the grain and was going to do the sifting process when it dried on her roof. And the archaeological evidence is that's the season and that's a small little thing,
Mm-hmm.
but that details it recorded for us in Joshua. It was the season of harvest. All that is there. She's hiding them under the sheaves of grain on her roof. So the harvest season was in full swing.
That's pretty cool.
Small little detail, but it's cool. About who she was and what was. But those bricks fall,
Yeah.
and you can still see them there. It's pretty cool.
Hmm.
There won't be very much longer because the Palestinians are not taking control of that environment, and they're letting it be degraded, I think, on purpose, to remove any Hebrew evidence of the place. But
One of the things that I didn't
neat
get to
place to
do
visit.
in the sermon, just because of time, was think about and go back to how this story was received to the people who were reading Hebrews 11, and thinking about like how they are under severe persecution. Some of them, they're being told to hold on to their faith, and they're reading the story about a woman who by all means should be counted out, but because she remained faithful, she's in the family of God. I mean, that is just so cool.
It's a forward-looking story, and when you go to Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is just outside of Jericho, and I've never been there because they've just recently cleared the landmines, and they can get a place where you can visit. That's no joke. In fact, the sign at the site, I saw this on Wayne Stiles, says, "Don't venture off the path. There are landmines."
There's a lesson in that too.
Boy, there is.
The road is narrow.
I think I have a picture of us driving past one of those signs.
Well, they're all over in Israel, but we don't tell people that. So, because they may not go with us. The site, though, is, okay, so we got the Elisha whirlwind story. We've got the parting of the river and the coming across to take the promised land, which is, what they, by faith, are anticipating. That's why the stories have been much more detailed to this point. After this, we're in the promised land, and we go forward. So this whole Hebrews 11 is to get them to focus forward, I think. But this is the place where Jesus goes to John the Baptist for baptism. And through Christ, we enter into our promised land by faith, right? Not through the act of baptism, but through faith and what God does through Jesus for us, promising us an eternal life. So I think there's a lot of power in that we connect to the story. So the original reader would have, these folks being Jewish in their audience, Christ followers now, but struggling, would have remembered that's a point of entrance.
Mm-hmm.
That's a point of starting to receive now what God has promised to us and the blessings and benefits of that. And so they're going to get the same thing through Christ. And it's meant to be encouragement to continue on for them. And I think they would have saw that.
Yep.
Good stuff. These old stories really mean something. These old kids' church stories, 10 were bad and 2 were good, are relevant to us today.
Absolutely.
Help us look forward in faith. All right. Thanks for joining us on the ReThink Podcast. We're going to wrap this one up. See you again next week.